Thank you. I'm Ron Fein, Legal Director of Free Speech for People. So when we first started working on this issue in the spring of 2016, a lot of people thought it was hypothetical. And part of the issue is that I think until recently people thought of foreign influence in elections in terms of hacking the vote count, in terms of changing recorded votes. But what we've seen increasingly is that it can equally apply to changing minds. And the way that I think of this when it comes to corporate activity is that advertising today is not just about Madison Avenue and Don Draper. It includes much more subtle techniques with names like guerrilla marketing and viral marketing, techniques that entities like Cambridge Analytica specialize in, that I'm sure everybody in this room would say that they're immune from persuasion. They can't possibly be influenced by these highly developed techniques. But as the father of public relations, Edward Bernays, noted 100 years ago, the very same techniques that can be used to effectively sell soap and cigarettes can also be used to influence public opinion in a democracy. And there's a reason that advertising is a $200 billion industry, and that's because, by and large, it works. So the example that we've all been drawn to from 2016 is what happened on Facebook. And obviously, not all of the details of this are fully known. But among them, we do know that there were over 3,000 ads from a shadowy Russian entity called the Internet Research Agency, LLC, a limited liability company based in St. Petersburg, Russia. And what we know about this suggests that at least one foreign government has discovered a relatively low-cost way to amplify divisions within the US electorate and perhaps to influence votes. But what's even worse, as Professor Coates has pointed out, is that foreign actors can leverage ownership stakes in American companies to influence our elections through the use of corporate dollars. And an example that I'd like to highlight is Uber. So Uber is a controversial company in many ways, but they certainly spend a lot in local elections. And Uber, for example, spent millions of dollars in an election in Austin, Texas recently on a ballot measure that would have, if it had passed, it would have helped Uber's business. And it probably would have drawn riders away from Austin's public transit system, which is more fuel efficient, meaning that if this had passed, it would have resulted in more gasoline being used. I'm not here to talk about the pros and cons of this particular ballot measure in Austin, Texas, only to say that after just a few weeks after Uber had spent all this money in the election, they revealed that they had taken an investment of $3.5 billion from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, of course, is an oil-rich country, which has long involved itself in US politics. So, for example, in 2014, it hired the chairman of a major congressional super PAC as its top lobbyist. And now it has a seat on the board of a company that spends millions of dollars in municipal elections. That $3.5 billion got it 5% ownership and a seat on the board. But this issue is not only about problematic petrostates. And I could give other examples involving Citgo, which is wholly owned by the government of Venezuela. But this also involves even countries that we think of as our close allies. And Canada is a great example. It is hard to conceive of a country with whom the US has a closer relationship than Canada. And yet, as we can see from the Mies v. Keane case, that involved Canada. The Blumen case involved Canadians. In 2012, a Connecticut-based subsidiary of a Canadian investment firm donated $1 million to Mitt Romney's super PAC. Obviously, Mitt Romney didn't win the election, but that $1 million would have been noticed. Right? That gets some influence. And I think the general principle is that this is not just a matter of high-stakes spycraft and state influence operations. It's that no investor from any foreign country should be in a position to exercise influence over a politically active American company. So what are some solutions? So as a base level, transparency can help us to at least find the problem. And there are some bills in Congress that have not yet passed, names like the Disclose Act and the Get Foreign Money Out of US Elections Act. California recently passed a disclosure legislation. That can help at least identify who is paying for what. But sometimes we need to go further. So the law, as Professor Fried identified, when it comes to a foreign national directly spending money in elections. The law doesn't say Vladimir Putin can spend as much as he wants in US elections as long as he reports it appropriately on the required forms. The law prohibits the Russian government from spending money in US elections. So the efforts that have taken place to address this problem on a substantive level have been mostly stymied at the federal level. So Ellen Weintraub is a commissioner of the Federal Election Commission, and she waged a lonely battle at the FEC to bring attention to this problem. She organized a day-long forum in the summer of 2016, in which Professor Coates testified on the problem of corporate political spending and foreign influence. Unfortunately, the FEC is divided, and it did not move forward, as she was unable to persuade enough of her fellow commissioners. In Congress, again, the statutory approaches that could address this at a substantive level have not even come close to passage. So in the meantime, cities and states are not waiting for the federal government to act. And that brings us to St. Petersburg. Now in this case, I don't mean St. Petersburg, Russia, where the Internet Research Agency, LLC, is based, but rather St. Petersburg, Florida, which is a city that is larger than you think, but it is not the largest city in the US by any means. And after a year and a half of an effort spearheaded by Free Speech for People at the national level and by local allies at the grassroots level, including the League of Women Voters of St. Petersburg, the American Promise Tampa Bay chapter, and other key local activists, in November 2017, the City Council of St. Pete passed a groundbreaking local ordinance that effectively bans political spending in city elections by corporations with a specified level of foreign ownership. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. Just so you know, other efforts going on. Connecticut, last year, one house of the legislature passed the same bill that we helped develop. This year it's been reintroduced. Massachusetts currently has a bill pending in the Massachusetts State Senate that we worked on with Common Cause of Massachusetts. So let me tell you what these bills do. These bills identify a category known as a foreign influenced corporation. And that is defined as meeting one of three tests. One test could be that a foreign national is directly or indirectly involved in making decisions about political spending by the corporation. Second category is if a single foreign investor owns 5% or more of the company's stock. And this 5% threshold is one that's generally recognized in corporate laws, one at which an investor can exercise influence over the corporate governance. And at that level, we presume that the corporation is potentially subject to foreign influence. And then the third category is if a group of foreign investors collectively, even if they're not working together, add up to 20% ownership. That 20%, not coincidentally, matches a threshold in the Federal Communications Act of 1934, which prohibits broadcast licensees, TV stations, common carriers, from having more than 20% foreign ownership. So if a company, corporation, LLC, or similar entity meets any of these three categories, it's deemed a foreign influenced corporation. And then it's prohibited from spending money directly in the election or from contributing to an entity like a super PAC that would spend the money itself. Obviously, the premise of this law is not xenophobia. It's not to discourage foreign investment. What it's to do is to ensure democratic self-government. So this legislation obviously is not going to cut off every possible route for foreign influence into our democracy, whether from corporations or anyone else. There are other routes. There's lobbying. There's large donations by foreign governments, foreign corporations to influential think tanks, contributions to social welfare nonprofit groups, and there are obviously going to be other possibilities. But this is a targeted solution to a key aspect of the problem. And when we started working on this aspect of the problem in 2016, people said it seemed a little hypothetical. Now people aren't saying that so much anymore. Thank you.